Welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and what a delight for us to have with us today Dr. Tevi Troy. He's the former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services for the George W. Bush administration and the author of a very interesting book entitled, Shall We Wake the President? Shall we wake him up? And he discusses when crises become a disaster. Dr. Troy, good to see you. Happy New Year.
Thanks for having me. Happy New Year to you as well, Perry.
Yeah, good to see you. Well, what made you write this book? Why'd you just take this one on?
So I worked in the Bush administration, as you said, and there were a number of disasters that we faced, such as Katrina and 9/11. And it occurred to me that there was very little thinking done about how government, and specifically how the president, deals in times of crisis. So talking to some friends suggested that I pursue this as a policy book, and then I decided to marry it with my love of presidential history. And I looked at how presidents have dealt with this over time.
Good for you. This ought to be pretty exciting. I haven't seen or read the book yet. I can look forward to it. How would you rate, President Obama's current management of problems?
Well, President Obama has not faced any of the crises of the level that we talk about in the book. Again, I'm talking about things with real massive ripple effects, many deaths. Again, think Katrina, 9/11, the 1927 Mississippi flood, the 1889 Johnstown flood, which killed 2,000 people. So he hasn't faced anything of that degree. But there is some evidence that he was surprised by the number of crises and problems that do come to the president's desk when in his first term, when there was the issue of the Somali pirates, he said to his aides, somewhat exasperatedly, "Who thought we were going to have to deal with pirates?" So there is that sense that the job comes on fast and furious and hits you pretty hard.
Wow. Let's go back to George W. Bush, 9/11. Of course, we all saw him in the classroom with the children when he got the news. So what's your take on that?
Obviously, it was a very difficult situation. Andy Card, the chief of staff, whispered in his ear, "America is at war." He chose not to get up at that moment and potentially panic the classroom. There was very little he could have done in the few minutes that he stayed to finish the story. So it probably was the right decision, but I'm not sure it took into account the immediacy of the TV cameras and the fact that you're always on when you're the president. But I think he was right to be careful in that first day. Ari Fleischer, who was his very savvy press secretary, held up a sign to him before he spoke to the media, and there was a handwritten sign that said, "Don't say anything yet," because presidents have to be very careful what they say in the first minutes of a crisis before we actually know what's going on. You don't want to say anything incorrect.
The whole handling of 9/11 was very interesting. Of course, they got him on Air Force One. I think he wanted to go back to Washington, but they ended up taking him to Offutt, didn't they?
Yeah, he made a couple of stops along the way. Of course, there was no idea whether this was a coordinated plot to actually kill the president. But finally, towards the end of the day, he insisted, "I have to get back to Washington." And he recognized the realities and the need for the American people to see their president in the seat of power. And he overrode the concerns of his security personnel and did return to Washington.
He got a lot of criticism for Katrina, not handling it fast enough. What's your take on that?
I agree that there was definitely some criticism to be had. In his own memoir, he gives himself some criticism, and he talks about areas where he was responsible. In my book, I have a list of the 5 best and the 5 worst presidents in terms of dealing with disaster, and I put Bush on both lists: 5 best for dealing with 9/11, 5 worst for dealing with Katrina. Even though I worked for the administration, and I think he's overly blamed for some aspects of it, there's no getting around that the Katrina response was a failed response.
Well, let's go through that list. Give us the 5 best.
Oh, well, will people buy the book if I give the whole 5 list?
No, just give me a couple.
No, I'll give you a couple.
Okay.
So I give high marks to Bill Clinton for actually preventing a disaster in terms of Y2K. The best disaster response is if you stop it from happening. Right. And he marshaled the federal government and the state governments, the local governments, private sector, international forces to work on making sure that that computer glitch that would have happened when the year went from 1999 to 2000 didn't melt down our computer system. So he gets high marks. On the worst list, I have Woodrow Wilson, who pretty much did nothing as 675,000 Americans died in the 1918 flu. He was warned that the troop transports taking American servicemen to World War I to fight in Europe were spreading the disease among the servicemen and to the people of Europe, and yet he did nothing. He didn't stop those troop transports. even though he was presented with his decision 1 month before the hostilities ended in Europe. So he had chances to alleviate that Spanish flu, which is a terrible, terrible flu, and he didn't do it.
What about, did you rate Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs?
You know, I didn't put Bay of Pigs in there as one of the types of crises, because I have 8 types of crises: 4 man-made and 4 and 4 natural. It didn't really fit in any of the categories, although I have talked about it in the context of first-year crises. A lot of presidents have faced crises in their first years. I already mentioned Bush and 9/11. Right. There was the 1929 stock market crash that was in Hoover's first year. I mentioned the 1889 flood that was in Harrison's first year, and so the first-year crisis is a problem, and obviously that is something that came up in Kennedy's first year, and he didn't handle it that well, but he did kind of recognize that he didn't have a handle on government and on foreign policy, and he made steps within how he structured administration to handle it better in the future.
The other thing was, I don't know if you covered it in your book, about the handling of President Johnson at the assassination of President Kennedy. Was that any on your scale anywhere?
So again, assassinations are not covered in the book per se, but I do cover the riots that took place in Washington and around the rest of the country after the assassination of Martin Luther King, because I have a whole chapter on civil unrest and how presidents can't handle that. Actually, Johnson didn't do so well in that circumstance. After these riots are taking place and you've got the devastation going on in Washington, and Johnson was pretty ineffectual in handling it. At one point, he flies over the affected areas in Marine One and looks down upon the devastation, and he looks eerily like President George W. Bush flying over the Katrina area in 2005. And so one of the lessons from the book is you may want to go to a disaster area as president, you may not want to go to a disaster area for various reasons, but you never, ever want to do a flyover.
Why is that?
Because it looks so bad. I mean, remember Bush in 2005, he got so much criticism and negative feedback for his flyover. And then, as I was saying, the Johnson flyover, he looked equally ineffectual. He's looking down impotently at what's going on below. So the flyover just shows a lack of compassion and a lack of involvement. You
know, the other thing, Dr. Troy, that's kind of interesting, sometimes presidents have a hard time responding to a disaster by going there themselves because of the security that's involved. It's got to be a tough call. Do I go or not go?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was getting at. When a president goes to a disaster area, he taxes local resources, meaning he takes people away from first response in order to do security cordons and to do motorcades and to do preparations for the event. You really don't need those people who are the first responders dealing with the needs of a presidential retinue. What you need is the first responders doing what they're supposed to do, which is first responding. So sometimes you have a president say, you know, I'm not going to go to the area. That was Bush's decision with Katrina. That was Obama's decision to some degree with Hurricane Sandy. He didn't go to New York City at that time. And so I think it's often a good move not to go to the area. But still, you have to show concern. You have to get on the TV and express what the worries of the American people are in those circumstances.
You know, disasters being what they are and crises being what they are, I mean, you're never ready for them. And I got to imagine that those first few moments of decision making, not only by the president themselves, but what about the staff? Do they wake up the president, as your title suggests? What's the process there? What did you experience?
Right, so I actually wrote a piece just on instances in history where presidents have been awakened, and there is actually a process. The Situation Room monitors what's going on all night in terms of whether there are things blowing up overseas, and they can notify the NSC, the National Security Council's executive secretary, who can notify the National Security Advisor and or the Chief of Staff. And those people would make the decision of whether actually to wake the president. President Obama, in a recent interview, said it doesn't happen that often. He said he was only been awakened 4 or 6 times over the course of his 8 years in the White House. And one of those times, interestingly enough, Barry, was when he was awarded the Nobel Prize early in his first term, a prize that many people say he didn't deserve. And he even sort of acknowledged that he didn't deserve it at that point. And but he was awakened to be notified of that.
Well, there you go. The one I have to ask you before we take a break, not necessarily the president, but the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, and Benghazi. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions about what was going on that evening. I wrote a previous book on presidential cultural interests. It's called What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted. It looks at TV they watched, movies they watched, books they read. And what I found is that Obama watches a lot of TV and tools around on his iPad at night. And it's very possible in those hours when people were wondering what to do that he was watching TV. With Hillary, it's much less clear what she likes to do in the evening, so I'm not really sure what she was doing. And being out of touch during a crisis is just a real problem. And so I think they earn low marks for that situation. All
right, the name of the book is Shall We Wake the President? There's a picture of it there on the screen by Dr. Troy. You may want to check it out at Barnes & Noble and Amazon. Let us take a quick break. We'll come back. And what does he anticipate with incoming President Trump? We'll be right back.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Hi, welcome back to Focus Today, and what a delight and an honor to have with us today Dr. Tevi Troy. He is the former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services for the George W. Bush administration. He wrote a book. It's a great one. You ought to check it out. Shall We Wake the President? Dealing with the decision of presidents during crises and disasters and what they are told, and I guess it's suggestion we wake them up in the middle of the night and tell them there's something going on, whether it's a Nobel Peace Prize or a real crisis. Dr. Troy, do you think that presidents, probably takes them a while to understand that no matter what happens in the country, they're seen as the father figure and they have to respond? Maybe that's a pressure they didn't think would be there. Is that true?
It's absolutely true that presidents are expected to be in charge in terms of crises. But what I find in the book, in Shall We Wake the President, that's so interesting, is that this was not always the case. That in the 19th century, in the 1800s, it was not expected that a president would take charge of a local disaster. And in fact, it was seen as not part of the constitutional responsibilities of the president. And it's only in the 20th century and now in the 21st century that we have these expectations. So that evolution is really one of the key stories of the book of Shall We Wake the President, on how presidents have gotten more involved with disasters and how the American people have increasingly expected more and more from the presidents when a disaster happens.
How does media play into this? I mean, we got social media now, instant information. That's got to be added pressure.
The media is huge. I mean, the media is one half of that story. I was explaining that in the 19th century, if there was a disaster, most of the American people didn't know about it. Unless it's in your local area, you don't really know that something happened. I tell the story in 1811, there was a huge earthquake in the Missouri area. President Madison doesn't know the extent of the damage for 6 weeks. So it was just a very different situation. Over time, you had the rise of radio and telegraph and more instantaneous communications. Now we have Twitter. I was on the West Coast, not far from you. I was in Washington State in 2011 when there was an earthquake in my home city of Washington, D.C. I knew within 30 seconds via Twitter that this earthquake had taken place. Wow. Madison obviously didn't know about this stuff for 6 weeks. So instantaneous communications really means that the American people recognize that something's happening and they look for someone to solve the problem. The person they look to is the president.
Does the incoming president's ideology kind of give you, as a staff or anybody else, an indication what this person may do during a crisis? And that kind of leads to the question, what do you think Trump will be like in a crisis?
Yeah, two different very interesting questions. I don't think ideology is determinative of how well you do in a crisis. One of the things I found that is your ability to communicate to the American people in a clear and compassionate way is really the number one indicator, and that really is not beholden to ideology. In terms of President-elect Trump, I've seen some positive indications, I must say, in terms of how he handled the Louisiana flooding. He went down there when other politicians weren't going down there, and he gave out supplies. He has a very good sense of communications and of the moment. One thing I do worry about is his willingness to go off the cuff. Remember, I told the story about Ari Fleischer telling President Bush, don't say anything yet. You've got to be very careful when a crisis happens not to say anything that's inaccurate or sends a bad message. So you really have to think about what you say, even as you have to respond quickly in a crisis. It's a difficult road to walk.
Well, you know, you go back and you look at 9/11, it's easy 20/20 hindsight, the way President Bush handled it, and of course you were right there in the middle of it. But I think one of the big moments was when he was standing on the rubble of the Twin Towers with the firemen and the bullhorn and basically said, we'll get him. We're going to go get him. I mean, that was a big moment, don't you think?
Absolutely, and I talk about that in my book, In Shall We Wake the President. I talk about how the initial response that President Bush gave was not great. In fact, his aides joked about his first address to the nation from the Oval Office was so bad they called it the awful office address. But he really did right the ship. He went on top of that destroyed fire truck. He grabbed the bullhorn. Somebody shouted, "We can't hear you." And he said, "Well, I can hear you, and the rest of the world is going to hear you." And that was really a galvanizing moment for the nation. So I agree. You're right to identify that as a crucial moment, and I talk about it in the book.
All right. Now, the other part of a crisis of a president is who writes the response. One of the things I think people are concerned about incoming President Trump, he knows how to Twitter. I mean, can we control this, and should it be controlled?
Yeah, look, I think Twitter is a very powerful tool. I think we saw in the campaign that President-elect Trump was able to get his message out over the heads of the media. But this is not a new story. When Franklin Roosevelt used to give his radio addresses, one of the reasons he became so good at radio was when he was governor of New York, he was concerned that all of the newspapers in New York State were Republican dominated, kind of different than what we think about today in terms of newspapers. But he wanted to go over the heads of the newspapers and go directly to the people. John F. Kennedy recognized what a helpful tool television was to him in his 1960 campaign. And in fact, at one point after he won the election, he walked past a TV and said, "We wouldn't have had a prayer without that gadget." And so similarly, now we have Twitter. It's another way for presidents to communicate directly with the people. Obviously, you must be careful with how you use it. But I've also heard indications that it's not just Trump making up tweets immediately and sending them off the cuff, but there is some thought that goes into them, and that there are aides who work with him on those tweets. But he works very hard to have a kind of natural style. It doesn't sound like it's going through 15 different drafts like the Hillary Clinton tweets did.
Let me draw on your love for presidential history. Coming through this cycle, it's unlike anything we've ever seen, right?
It's true. That's one of the reasons I love politics. It's always unlike everything you've ever seen. But this one is a real different one for the ages. There'll be many books written about this one.
Well, we got a president that's never held public office, hasn't served in the military, but has made billions of dollars by being a smart guy. That's kind of an interesting combination.
It absolutely is, and you're right to point out to this. We've had other presidents who weren't elected to anything before, like Eisenhower, but they all had some government experience, meaning that they may have served in the military. So Trump is very different. But I will say one of our least experienced presidents in terms of government service was Abraham Lincoln, and he did a pretty good job. I'm not comparing Trump to Abraham Lincoln, but I am saying that experience doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be good at the job.
All right, so I don't know we certainly don't want to see any crises or disasters, but we could see some that may not be acts of God. They could be acts of terrorism, or they could be financial disasters and crises. You can't really separate all those, can you?
Well, in the book, I do have separate chapters on each of these. So I have a chapter on how to deal with financial crises, how to deal with terror attacks, how to deal with acts of God, including weather disasters and also viral outbreaks. So I think they do belong in different buckets. But what I found is there are certain skills that presidents need to have for dealing with all these crises. It's sort of called the all hazards approach by disaster experts, that you have certain tools for dealing with disasters. You don't know what the disaster you're going to face is, but you need to apply and deploy those tools for each of the disasters. You just have to do it in a nimble and agile way.
So one of the goals of a president during a crisis is to show, that person is calm, and he's in control, and he's informed. I mean, you have to communicate that, don't you?
Absolutely. Look, in the end of the book, at the end of Shall We Wake the President, I have a list of 9 things a president should do, or 9 skills a president needs to have. And when I looked at the list after I wrote it, I realized that 6 out of the 9 had to do with communications. Because the truth is, the president is not stopping a flood personally with his own hands. The president's not injecting vaccines to prevent a disease spread, but he is communicating to the American people about what the government is doing, about what the individual should be doing, and kind of registering the level of either panic or concern that the people should have. You need to be able to mobilize the people to do difficult things, like take a vaccine, for example, but you also need not to generate panic. It's a tough line to walk.
All right, the book is entitled Shall We Wake the President? And there's a picture of it there on the screen. Check it out at Barnes & Noble or online at Amazon. Shall We Wake the President? Are you working on something else for your love of the presidency?
I do have an idea that I'm working on with my agent. Stay tuned, and I'd love to come back and talk to you about it when it comes out.
Yeah, we'd love to have you. Dr. Troy, good to see you, my friend. Happy New Year to you.
Thanks. Happy New Year.
All right, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.